In 94 years of the Academy Awards, there have been hundreds of Oscar winners, but 10 actually changed movie history. America in the 1930s was sharply divided along racial lines. Even in the mixed movie theaters, black people had to sit in the balcony, in the cheap seats. Against this backdrop, Hollywood made Gone with the Wind, one of the most successful and controversial films of all time. The Oscars a year later were a sensation.
In supporting roles during 1939 to Hattie McDaniel.
At the 1940 Academy Awards, Hattie McDaniel became the first African American to win an Oscar. It was hailed as a triumph over racism.
I sincerely hope I shall always be a credit to my race and to the motion picture industry. My heart is too full to tell you just how I feel. And may I say thank you, and God bless you.
But even the ceremony was racially segregated.
Hattie McDaniel, who plays Mammy in the film, won the Best Supporting Actress Award. But at the ceremony itself, she was not seated in the front of the room. She was seated in the back of the room.
Black audiences, then and now, criticized McDaniel for her portrayal of Mammy, which many said was a crude stereotype that put a smiling face on white supremacy.
If you don't care what folks says about this family, I does. I has told you that she can always tell a lady but the way that she eat in front of folks like a bird. And I ain't aiming for you to go to Mr. John Wilkins's and eat like a field hand and gobble like a hog.
Fiddle-dee-dee. Ashley Wilkes told me he liked to see a girl with a healthy appetite.
It has, as the heroic characters, essentially, Civil War soldiers from the South, from the Confederacy. And it defends a certain way of life and mythologizes it.
After Gone with the Wind, McDaniel was stereotyped herself. She played versions of Mammy in dozens of other films.
She was later criticized in the black community for regularly accepting roles as domestic servants and other kinds of, not fully articulated characters.
McDaniel struck back at her critics, saying, "I'd rather play a maid than be a maid." She remained a pioneer. She was the first black woman to sing on radio in the United States and the first black host of a national radio show. And as the first black Oscar winner, she paved the way for a new generation of black performers in Hollywood. 2 years after Hattie McDaniel's historic win, another pioneer made a masterpiece that would change the language of American cinema. When Orson Welles made Citizen Kane, he was just 25 and had already revolutionized 2 art forms. Welles had wowed Broadway with an all-black adaptation of Shakespeare's Macbeth. And his radio version of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds was so realistic, it caused real-world panic in the streets. For his Hollywood debut, Welles picked an epic tale of the rise and fall of newspaper magnate Charles Foster Kane. This one movie was enough to earn Welles a place in cinema history and a place of honor at the Academy Award Museum in Los Angeles. With Welles' singular artistic vision, Citizen Kane changed the sound, look, and feel of cinema. When Welles arrived in Hollywood, he demanded complete creative control. He would be in charge of everything. He even cast himself in the starring role, playing Kane from 20-year-old upstart to 80-something paranoid recluse.
He's the writer, he's the star, he's the director, he's the producer, the perfect puppet master, if you will.
Welles learned everything about movie making while making Citizen Kane. He borrowed heavily from German expressionist cinema, using dark shadows and forced perspective to comment on his characters, and pioneered the use of deep focus, where figures both close up and in the distance of a shot can be seen clearly.
Hello, Jedediah.
It's a compilation of a lot of really specific and fascinating techniques that come together in one film for the very, very first time. So in this way, it's kind of like a master class in synthesis of all of the highlights of, the greatest of the Panachrome 1940s films and the greatest of the German expressionist cinema coming together in the hands of this creative genius.
But more than the style of the film, Wells's model for directors that came after him broke new ground.
He was in charge of the film, and I think that was the main achievement. We had someone who was not a studio boss who was in total control of a production, but some kind of creative author, some kind of creative author with the stamina and the pertinence of Orson Welles. I think in hindsight, it's much more that effect than the special aesthetics of the film.
Welles spent the rest of his career trying and failing to regain that complete creative control. While Welles struggled to fulfill his creative vision, another filmmaker wrote a love story that broke the Hollywood blacklist. The Oscar for this romantic classic actually helped end America's Red Scare.
The Red Scare was, of course, the fear of communism in the USA, although it was a very tiny faction of people who were in the Communistic Party of America, or even fellow travelers, had never the position to gain any momentum and political relevance.
In the 1950s, at the height of the Cold War, Hollywood came under attack for its alleged communist leanings. Right-wing Senator Joseph McCarthy started claiming that Hollywood was full of communist sympathizers.
He started looking for communists, and the film industry was a very easy place to find them because they were writing films and they were writing stories that could be construed as potentially propagandistic or in favor of communism.
One target were a group of writers and directors known as the Hollywood 10, who refused to testify. The most famous of them was star screenwriter Dalton Trumbo.
Because they refused to answer the questions of the committee, and they refused to name names of other people that they knew of who had potentially been in some kind of communist meetings, they were blacklisted.
There were protests, but the Hollywood 10 got jail time. Their studios fired them. 10 of the more than 300 actors, writers, and directors on the Hollywood blacklist. Dalton Trumbo continued to write in secret, giving other writers credit for his screenplays. For the screenplay of Roman Holiday, the name on the credits was Ian McKellen Hunter. Trumbo references this deception in a classic scene from the film. A mouth of truth bites the hands of liars. In 1954, Trumbo's screenplay won the Oscar. It was the first blow against the Hollywood blacklist. 6 years later, Trumbo wrote the script for Spartacus under his own name.
This broke the dam. This allowed a lot of other previously blacklisted performers and writers to come back, but not everybody. Many of them had very tragic ends. Many of them never worked again.
The real end of Hollywood censorship would come later, thanks in part to an X-rated film that won the Oscar for Best Picture. Scenes like this were why Midnight Cowboy was so controversial. John Folk as hustler Joe Buck getting oral sex from a man in a porn theater. For decades, Hollywood had kept sex of all kinds out of the movies, thanks to the Hays Code, a self-censorship system requiring all films to fulfill certain moral obligations.
If you would take it seriously nowadays, no film would ever be shot. For instance, you shouldn't swear, or you shouldn't show, that's clear, should no nudity at all.
Homosexuality was strictly forbidden, coming under the banned category of wrongdoing, evil, or sin.
Essentially, after the Hays Code came into effect, there really wasn't any depiction of homosexuality.
They gotta have some kind
Midnight Cowboy was one of the first movies made after the Hays Code was abandoned in 1968.
I'm walking here! I'm walking here!
The film doesn't make its homosexuality explicit, but many read the relationship between Joe Buck and his pimp Rizzo as queer.
I know enough to know that that great big dumb cowboy crap of yours don't appeal to nobody except every jackie on 42nd Street. That's faggot stuff. You want to call it by its name, that's strictly for fags.
John Wayne, you don't tell me he's a fag?
A month after the film opened, there were the Stonewall riots, which kick-started the gay liberation movement.
So by the time you have Midnight Cowboy rolling around, the world is really changing. And yet it's also the same years where you have films like Dr. Dolittle, and Mary Poppins, So it shows how starkly things were transforming.
Not everyone got the memo. Midnight Cowboy lost the Best Actor race to public homophobe John Wayne. Our next Oscar winner didn't just shake up Hollywood conventions, he blew them away. The 1995 Oscars was a showdown between two iconic American movies. Both had memeable lines.
Run, Forrest, run!
You read the Bible, Griff.
But one was a $60 million feel-good studio movie about the American dream.
My mom always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
Oh, he is true.
The other, a violent indie film made for less than $10 million.
And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger those who attempt to poison and destroy my brothers. And you will know my name is the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon thee.
Forrest Gump is a very American movie, both in like the themes, the way that it looks, like it's very traditional. It's like a feel-good film, and Pulp Fiction is just like brash and crazy and just Tarantino's mind.
Pulp Fiction got 7 Oscar nominations. Forrest Gump got 13. On the big night, the first Oscar went to Pulp Fiction.
I think this is probably the only award I'm going to win here tonight. So I was trying to think, maybe I should just say a whole lot of stuff right here, right now, just get it all in my system. But I'm not. Thanks.
The Oscar goes...
The rest of the night belonged to...
Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump, yes.
Forrest Gump.
But it was Pulp Fiction, not Forrest Gump, which inspired a generation of filmmakers. In America and around the world, directors copied Tarantino's combination of slick dialogue and violent action, pop culture references, and a mashup approach to storytelling.
I definitely think that Pulp Fiction has been really influential, not just in terms of like directorial style and aesthetics, but also in storytelling and attention to detail, and that this kind of like throwing whatever at the audience and not necessarily having to create a linear narrative that happens in 3 acts.
Our next winner broke a shameful 80-year Oscar tradition. The 2010 Oscars was David versus Goliath, the champion Avatar, the highest-grossing film of all time. The challenger, The Hurt Locker, a low-budget war movie. It was a showdown between Hurt Locker director Kathryn Bigelow and her ex-husband, Avatar director James Cameron. Plus, there was this big gender gap. In 80 years, the Oscars had nominated 400 filmmakers as Best Director. Only 3 had been women, and none had ever won.
You'd had people like Jane Campion nominated for The Piano. You had Lena Wertmuller, nominated very late in her career, back in 1975. Sofia Coppola nominated. The fact that I can say them all in about 10 seconds, it's not good enough.
But Bigelow's take on the very masculine genre of the war film struck a chord with the Academy. The Hurt Locker is a nail-biting action thriller that is also anti-war and anti-conflict. It won 6 Oscars, including Best Director for Catherine Bigelow.
It was really quite radical that she won at the time, and for a war picture, and for a very small war picture that really had a very, limited box office success.
I sort of love that she won while beating her ex-husband, James Cameron. I thought that was sort of delicious.
After Bigelow, Chloe Zhao won Best Director in 2021, Jane Campion in 2022.
Within the space of just, I think, a little more than a decade, looking at 3 women directors winning Best Director after none has won before. That's huge.
But let's not get too excited. A recent study found women directed just 9% of the top-grossing films of 2022. There was an even bigger Oscar surprise a few years later, with an on-stage drama that made history.
The Academy Award for Best Picture.
You're impossible. Come on. La La Land.
There's a mistake. Moonlight, you guys won Best Picture.
I was in the LA Times newsroom, and it was shocking, it was thrilling, it was horrifying too. It was truly the stop the presses moment of the Academy Awards from the past several years.
The mix-up was high farce, but took away from the big story of the night, Moonlight, the first Black LGBTQ+ film to win an Oscar.
Good night. Thank you so much.
That was really incredibly exciting for me. Because Moonlight was a film that I watched and I talked about with my friends and my peers, and that it was a film that everyone that I knew, in my cohort was really excited about.
2 years before Moonlight, activist April Raines started the Oscars So White campaign, protesting how ethnic minorities were being shut out of the Academy Awards. For the 2015 Oscars, every single actor nominated was white.
That is not good enough. If you're saying that the best 20 performers of the year are all white, maybe you're not looking at the spread of films you should be looking at.
Yeah, you trying to get smart with me, huh?
Moonlight was everything Oscars So White had been calling for, a fully realized Black LGBTQ+ story that brought marginalized voices to the mainstream.
I think one thing that is really important about Oscars So White, and I think one thing that it did to help Moonlight, is that I think sometimes articulating the problem makes it harder to ignore.
In 2017, a record-breaking 5 Black filmmakers won Oscars. And under pressure from RAINN and Black directors, the Oscar Academy has added hundreds of new, non-white members. #Oscars not quite so white. 2 years after Moonlight, the Oscars stopped being Luddites and learned to love streaming. The Oscars used to hate that sound. Since the start of Netflix, Oscar voters have been trying to keep streaming films out of the Academy Awards. The first Netflix original film, Beasts of No Nation, was a critical hit, but got dumped by the Academy, with no nominations. Dee Rees's Mudbound, another critical fave, got 4 Oscar nominations, but won none.
A large part of that resistance had to do with just skepticism of what Netflix could create. Could it be prestigious? Is it up to the standard of excellence? I also think it borrows a bit from just a general anxiety between traditional institutions and the internet. The sense that anything that originates online is of lesser quality than anything that came from the traditional forms of cultural production.
Then came Roma. Everything about Alfonso Cuarón's Netflix movie, the black and white cinematography, the long tracking shots, the widescreen images, screamed cinema. Even Netflix haters loved it.
the Oscar goes to Roma.
On the big night, Roma won 3 Oscars, including Best Director for Alfonso Cuarón. Just 4 years later, Apple TV's Coda, another online-first movie, won Best Picture. The Oscars had learned to love streaming. What Roma did for streaming, our next Oscar winner did for African cultures in Hollywood.
I, Zuri, son of Badu, give to you Prince T'Challa, the Black Panther.
Before Black Panther, African cultures were almost invisible at the Oscars.
And the Oscar goes to Black Panther Ruth Carter!
But by the time costume designer Ruth Carter won her Oscar, she'd spent a lifetime celebrating African art.
Wow, I got it. I felt that my whole entire life had been a journey in recreating Black history, in presenting the culture of Black Americans and the African diaspora. And Black Panther specifically was a culmination of everything that I had done my entire career.
Carter worked with director Spike Lee, taking inspiration from Black styles past and present to design costumes for films like Malcolm X and Do the Right Thing.
Well, I came from a family that was always very much into, Black nationalism and really kind of knowing a bit about your heritage. And but it was a very big, broad, general knowledge. So what Black Panther allowed me to do was really take a deeper dive into the Himba tribe or the Tuareg, and what was North Africa, what was South Africa, and we actually were inspired by them to create these fictitious groups in Wakanda.
Black Panther was infused with real African traditions. Queen Ramonda's crown was modeled on a Zulu headdress. The red armor and spears of the Maasai tribe inspired the costumes for female warriors, the Dora Milaje. Princess Suri's stacked neck rings come from the ceremonial jewelry of the Ndebele tribe of South Africa. Black Panther also drew from Afrofuturism, an art movement that imagines what African cultures could become if freed from the history of colonialism.
I think when Black Panther came out, there was a real sensibility already of like a Pan-African diasporic kind of popularity. Like that was already in the pop culture, like that was already being celebrated in a lot of ways.
Black Panther became one of the most successful movies of all time.
Because when I started in the late 80s, early 90s, I felt like, they weren't giving budgets to Black films because they didn't feel that they were making the box office. I think this proved that whole concept wrong. And we've been proven Hollywood wrong, so much since Black Panther.
Our final Oscar winner proved Hollywood wrong about the oldest tradition at the Academy Awards. There have been Best Picture winners set in Morocco, set in Rome, and even set in China. But for 91 years, every single one was in English. Filmmakers who changed the language of cinema, like Federico Fellini and Akira Kurosawa, Ingmar Bergman or Yasuguru Oshii, never won Oscar's top prize. Their native language was too big a hurdle. It took a Korean film to make the Oscars truly go global, Bong Joon-ho's Parasite.
And the Oscar goes to Parasite.
For a Korean language film to win Best Picture, it was a shock to me, and I think it's a brilliant shock.
In Parasite, Bong Joon-ho took a very Korean story about two families, one poor, one rich, and their mutually parasitic relationship, and told it with the stylistic aplomb of a Quentin Tarantino or an Alfred Hitchcock. He beat Hollywood at its own game.
I mean, this film made more than $53 million at the US box office, more than $263 million worldwide. What a success story. And I hope it keeps people's minds open to what is the Oscar? What is the best picture of the year? It's not necessarily who the studios are telling you.
With Parasite, the Oscars finally opened up to the whole wide world of cinema.
It just made me so happy. I mean, it was the first time in 92 years, I think it was, that a non-English language film had won. It's been this long path. Parasite was the one that made it happen. I think we should see the Parasite win not as some weird one-off, not as an outlier, but as, a potential, like a beacon, a harbinger of what could still happen.
94 years into the Academy Awards, and the Oscars are just starting to tap their global potential. What are your favorite Oscar winners? Who were the biggest Oscar fails? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe.